chosen by the world legacy. The rulers of this star were not human. That world was ruled by 7 mechanical lifeforms known as the Mekk-Knights. And, across the land, spread their vanguard, the crawlers. These crawlers tend to swarm and destroy all human-made structures in their path. They most likely lack any emotions, helpless before those ruthless machines. Mankind had no choice but to live in hiding. Dense with thick trees, gloomy even in the daytime, a hinterland known as Forest of the Stars. Therein lays a hidden village where humans lived inconspicuously. The village was protected by a barrier that would prevent intruders from invading, or even discovering it. The ritual wand, passed down through many generations, made the barrier extremely resistant, and it had never broken, not once. But even so, the villagers were suffocated by their anxieties day after day, not knowing when the great threat would come knocking at their doorstep. From within the suffocating unease of the village, there were still those determined to fend off the crawlers. Orym and Ningirsu, there was a reason they fought so desperately. It was the village priestess, and the younger sister of Ningirsu, IB. From birth, the priestesses possess a divine power that synergizes with their ritual wand to create barriers. IB's power was the strongest the village had ever seen in its history, but it was meager compared to the frightening forces that grew stronger by the day. Her companions saw how hard she was trying to put on a brave face for the villagers, and wished they could lighten her burden, even by a little. Orym and Ningirsu, along with the baby dragon Embark, crossed the barrier in hopes of slaying even just one crawler. One day, IB heard from inside the forest a faint sound like that of a human voice. Orym and Ningirsu could not hear it. However, IB proclaimed that she keeps hearing the voice. Afraid IB would venture into the forest alone, Orym, Ningirsu, and the baby dragon Embark set foot inside the hinterland. The sun had already set, leaving only starlight to guide them. The scent of trees and soil hung in the cold air. Though her footing was unsure, IB ventured into the forest as if she was being guided. Careful not to lose sight of her, the three looked out for crawlers as they followed her. Suddenly, with an abrupt shriek, IB vanished before their eyes. Rushing to the place where they'd lost sight of her, they saw IB had fallen off a low cliff. It appeared IB had been so spellbound in the direction of the voice that she hadn't noticed there was no ground before her. The three descended the cliff and were relieved to find IB uninjured. Before their eyes, a mysterious structure appeared. If it had been there before, they would have noticed it, but, as if the structure had been there for hundreds of years, it was ensconced in trees and entwined in ivy. They nervously approached the building. The wand IB held in her hand glowed, and the building started to rumble, as if in response. A mighty light radiated from the building, blowing aside the trees and cloaking everything in blinding light. Even with their eyelids closed, the light pierced mercilessly through. When they finally opened their eyes, a fairy fluttered in the air before them. The fairy spoke to the startled party.
I am Li, the World Chalice Fairy, a spirit that had been sealed inside the building that released the bright light known as the World Legacy World Chalice.
In previous times, it was her duty to guide mankind, but was obstructed by the Mekk-Knight. For many years, she had been waiting for a world hero capable of activating the World Chalice, and that they are those world heroes.
Please, lend me your strength and gather the scattered starlight and save the world from the great darkness.
She spoke. Though bewildered by Li's story, Orym and the group were moved by her earnestness and decided to lend a hand. Hearing their resolve, the fairy Li smiled and bestowed upon them the powers of the awakened World Chalice.
To protect humankind.
Accepting Lee's earnest wishes, Orm and the group promised to help her. Accompanied by Lee, the group set off to return to the village, but they encountered several crawlers who blocked their way. Orm, Ningirsu, and Imduk stood before the crawlers with their new strength coursing through their bodies. As they stood between the monsters and what they set out to protect, tension hung heavy in the air. A cold sweat dripped from Orm's chin and dampened the forest soil. As the great tension crescendoed, the party suddenly seized upon their foes, lunging toward the exoskeletons of the crawlers. Orm's sword cleaved the enemies with ease, Ningirsu's lance pierced nimbly, and Imduk's claws teared ferociously at their metal hides. The battle was over almost as quickly as it had started. The power of the World Chalice that Lee had granted them was much greater than expected. They couldn't conceal their surprise at the World Chalice's great power that now dwelled in their bodies. According to Lee, there are 6 more world legacies in the world with equal power to the World Chalice. If they were to be recovered, it would be possible not only to destroy the crawlers, but to destroy the Mekk-Knights who ruled the world. This information provided a great ray of hope for the village people who've lived so long in the gloomy forest. Following Lee's words and the guidance of the World Chalice, the young folks of the Forest of the Stars set out on a journey to seek the next world legacy. And so began the journey of Orm and the party in search of the world legacy. Although the party was on a mission to save the world, as their first time in the outside world, everything they saw and heard felt fresh and vivid. No matter how many crawlers would appear, Orm and his friends would fight them off, and they did so for several days. How long must they have walked, with Lee as their guide, and the World Chalice as their beacon? A humid wind caressed their cheeks. Before the party lay a vast swamp. A great artifact was submerged in the muddy expanse, the giant armor lying in the bog. Was one of the express purposes of this trip the world legacy known as the World Armor. However, they found more than just the World Armor there. Not only on the surface of the armor, but also on the inside dark figures squirmed. Like ants on the corpse of a dead insect, crawlers swarmed on the world armor. Their number was countless. From a red monocular emanated a bizarre light that filled the party's field of vision. The horrific sound of the crawlers' metal hides scraping against each other united into a thunderous cacophony, as if the earth were shaking. Standing before the 3 were superior specimens possessing power far greater than the crawlers that had crossed their path previously. Witnessing an overwhelming sight, the party decided it was reckless to try to break through from the front. On Lee's suggestion, the 3 friends dared not engage, and instead headed for the world armor. With the world armor in front of them, Orum's party became blocked by a swarm of crawlers. No matter how many monsters they defeated, a new swarm appeared, trampling the debris of the fallen. Now divided, the party struggled. The seemingly endless battles had whittled the party's strength down to almost nothing. They were unable to advance, but retreating wasn't an option either. They had no choice but to fight until all strength was gone. Just then, as Orum and the party were about to collapse, Lee called out to them.
By defeating the superior X-Crawler, you should be able to halt the movements of the other crawlers.
In the midst of the battle, Lee had discovered that the X-Crawler was the commander of the crawlers. Trusting Lee's insight, the party pierced through the siege and closed in on the X-Crawler. The X-Crawler resisted fiercely, but they channeled the last of their strength to defeat it. Just as the commander collapsed, the swarm of crawlers surrounding the party suddenly stopped moving. Greatly wounded, Orum and the party finally arrived under the world armor, but there were more than just crawlers there. 7 colors of light suddenly shone down from the heavens. There appeared the 7 knights. The figures before them were metallic, and emitted a radiant glow that enveloped their bodies in a lustrous light. The Mekk-Knights, who ruled over mankind and all of the world, had now descended to this very place. Orum and his friends found it difficult to describe the figures with mortal words, and could only stand frozen in their otherworldly presence. Then, suddenly, the Mekk-Knights reached their hands out, silently. A mysterious energy sprung forth from their hands and began to shroud IB. IB was exhausted now, completely spent. The magical barrier provided by IB had no resistance to the force field. The rest of the party desperately struggled to rescue IB. However, with the same light from which they appeared, IB and the 7 knights vanished without a trace. Lee cautioned of the danger if IB's wand were stolen and the other world legacies fell into the wrong hands. Orum and his comrades set out to rescue IB and recover the next world legacy. Gift of the Martyr. IB was held captive. The stolen ritual wand was sealed inside the core of a Mekk-Knight blue sky, its power source. She'd been captured forcibly, but up to this point, the Mekk-Knights hadn't laid a hand on her. IB was deep in thought.
The Great Darkness is using the crawlers to threaten humankind. What if humankind's perception of the Mekk-Knights had been wrong all along?
Meanwhile, Orum and the party arrived at the base of the Mekk-Knights after their long quest to rescue IB. Ruins of a forgotten civilization lay before them. The husks of decayed buildings long buried by crustal movements barely broke the ancient Earth's surface. Among them, artificial forms lay untouched in pristine condition. There the activated World Legacy World Shield shone brightly, and the World Legacy known as the World Lance rose sharply out of the earth. Even with the power of the World Chalice, it was a fool's errand to challenge the Mekk-Knights. Following Lee's words, Orum and the group decided on a sneak attack on the World Shield. Before the party, a knight appeared, then another. Previously they wouldn't have stood a chance, but now it was different. They had to rescue IB. Their determination made them fight with blood-curdling ferocity. Sensing danger, the Mekk-Knights transformed into a united form, the Mekk-Knight Spectrum Supreme. Orym and friends battled the Mekk-Knight Spectrum Supreme, the culmination of the Mekk-Knight's power, with all their might. As the tide turned in the battle, Ningirsu gathered his strength and put his all into one decisive strike of his spear. However, his attack was parried by the Mekk-Knight Spectrum Supreme, opening a large hole in the wall. The already fragile ruins couldn't withstand the impact and began to collapse. Before the dust settled, so as not to be noticed by the Mekk-Knight Spectrum Supreme, Ningirsu directed a subtle glance toward Lee. Noticing his glance, Lee nodded slightly and slipped from the battlefield. She'd signaled her intentions, to infiltrate the base alone and rescue IB. Lee flew feverishly before finally arriving at IB. IB breathed a sigh of relief when she saw Lee there, unharmed. But her relief was short-lived as she learned that the others were battling the Mekk-Knights. Maybe it was they who were wrong to battle the Mekk-Knights. To know the truth, she had to stop the battle immediately. As IB uttered those words, Lee, who stood in front of her, now slowly turned around. Upon their first meeting, Lee had greeted IB with the warm smile of a fairy. But her smile had transformed, now blackened and hideous. Terrified, IB sought to scream, but her consciousness was consumed by deep darkness before she could utter a noise. Orym and the others continued to battle. All of a sudden, an explosion occurred inside the facility. Immediately, Orym felt as if the world chalice awakened again, though the feeling was now greatly intensified. Everyone on the battlefield stopped fighting, transfixed at that moment. Just then, a figure appeared. She was standing on the mountain of the debris before them. It was the visage of IB, unmistakable from head to toe. But her face betrayed something sinister. Her eyes glowed mysteriously, and an evil aura emanated from her body. These signs suggested that the figure before them was not the IB they knew. Her laughter was nothing like that of IB. She now spoke to the confused group.
I am Lee. This body is now mine.
Sweet IB was no longer here. The feminine resonance of her voice was now poisoned with a booming dissonance. Orym and the others glared at her with confusion and anger. Meeting their gaze, Nightmare Corruptor Blee emitted a force field. The force field now forcibly absorbed the power of the World Chalice within Orym and the others, and now, it threatened to take their lives. However, it would be the Mekk-Knight Spectrum Supreme, whom they'd been fighting to the death just moments before, who would rescue them. Throwing itself at them, the power of Blee was so great it caused the form of the Mekk-Knight Spectrum Supreme to become unjoined. Separated into 7, the Mekk-Knights were severely damaged. Then Blee, with a familiar hand, proceeded to extract the cores from each of the Mekk-Knights, one by one. It was now clear there was great danger in Blee possessing both the power of IB as well as that of the ritual wand. Seeking to prevent this, the Mekk-Knight Blue Sky sought to transfer control of the wand to someone other than IB. Showing considerable growth in battle, Orym was the one chosen as the wand's successor. Blee's power created a shockwave that launched Orym to the edge of the cliff. The Mekk-Knight Blue Sky stretched out its arm to help him. Wordlessly their gaze met. Orym sensed in his heart that the knight was trying to convey something when a dazzling light shone suddenly. The next moment, Orym, adorned in new armor, not of the World Chalice, and holding a sword in each hand, stood at the edge of the cliff as Mekk-Knight Avram, successor to the ritual wand. Once owned by IB, the ritual wand was passed down through generations in the village of the Forest of the Stars. It was the key to the fate of the stars and held the power to unlock the world legacies. In a split-second decision, Orym had been chosen to succeed the wand, not by the wand's controller, IB, but by the Mekk-Knights. Then, the succession of the key was split into 2, just like its pair sword was. Knowing IB, resting inside of her, still possessed the key's power, Blee set off to gain possession of the world lance before Orym could reach it. Orym chased after her, determined to stop her. However, in his path stood the nightmare beasts, born from the power contained in the cores that Blee stole from the Mekk-Knights. Orym, having just received his new powers, had to contend with the formidable strength of the 6 nightmare beasts. Now Ningirsu, who'd rushed to Orym's side along with Embark, said to him,
"We'll hold them back, you go ahead."
His voice was quiet but resolute. Having lost the power of the World Chalice, Ningirsu knew he would be powerless to stop Blee, even if he could catch her. Without waiting for Orum's reply, Ningirsu leaped out facing the beasts, spear in hand. Though nearly powerless, Ningirsu still deftly handled his spear as if possessed. As the nightmare mermaid was crushed, the beasts all turned their heads toward the spear wielder in unison. He must have wanted to pursue his little sister more than anybody else. Orum took off to pursue Iblis and the World Lance, with the determination of Ningirsu as the wind in his sails. Left alone, Ningirsu continued to fight by himself, his roars echoing throughout the battlefield. Orum rushed to the base of the World Lance, but it was too late. By the time he arrived, Iblis had already finished activating the World Lance. With the newfound power of the World Lance, Iblis launched an aggressive assault on Orum. With such destructive force that each blow shook the earth, Orum faced the attacks alone. In the face of those attacks, Orum now lay wounded on the ground. Iblis moved to pick up Orum's discarded sword, now swinging it over and over, as if to check its weight. Then Iblis moved in closer to inflict the final blow on Orum. Orum couldn't move his upper body, let alone stand up. Just as Iblis raised the sword to strike, a small shadow emerged from Orum's cloak. The young dragon Embark summoned his otherworldly power between the young boy and girl, determined to help his companions in their time of crisis with whatever he could muster. That power suppressed the evil that dwelled in IB, if only for a moment. By suppressing Li's evil spirit, the spirit of IB that had resided deep in the depths had now awakened. Orum laid on the ground powerless. Embark was exhausted of his powers and unable to move. And IB was now holding a sword in her hand. Realizing her situation, she made her decision. Only she could put an end to Li's evil desires. Her hand that held the sword now tensed with strength. Li realized IB's intentions and tried to resist, but IB's awakened spirit overcame her. She sees a flashback of her childhood friend desperately calling in her direction. The young girl drew short, rapid breaths, points the blade towards herself and... When Ningirsu arrived at the scene, he saw his childhood friend holding the limp body of his little sister in his arms, repeatedly calling her name. At the cruel end of this surreal scene, the older brother could do nothing but stand there, stunned and speechless. The secret powers of the planet. A few years had passed since that nightmare of a tragedy. When Orum awoke, he found that the girl and her brother were no longer with him. Was IB really gone now, for good? The loss of the girl had its grip over Orum's heart like an unbreakable vice.
I couldn't protect IB. If only I were stronger. Then, her death could have been avoided.
The battle had left a chasm in Orum's heart. Now that IB was gone, Orym had tasted for the first time just how terrifying a battle could be, and how devastating losing Samyan you treasured could be. He didn't have the heart to go on with his journey, not for now. However, there was still one thing on his mind that bothered him. It was Ningirsu. Even now, Orym still had no idea where he had gone. No doubt despair had taken him, now that his beloved sister was no more. And when Orym thought about how Ningirsu must be feeling right now, his heart became fraught with an immovable weight. But that was exactly why Orym had to go after his childhood friend. And so, the swordsman resumed his journey with Embark. It was when panic was beginning to settle in Orym's mind. Was it coincidence? Or did the Mekk-Knight that dwelled within him lead him to it? He stumbled across a dormant crawler. It occurred to Orym that this might lead to a clue. He could try and restore it and see if its communication system still worked. Orym succeeded in restoring the crawler and gained access to its communication system, along with a number of records that detailed areas in which the swarms were active, and data on the locations where many crawlers had been destroyed. Perhaps there was still some life left in those areas, and if there was, maybe they would know where Ningirsu had gone. Armed with his new clue, Orym set off to the areas he had gleaned from the records. However, as useful as the information was, it unfortunately didn't make Orym's expedition any easier. There was nary a sign of life to be spotted anywhere, and the journey was looking like it could end in vain. Nature, uncaring and unrelenting, continued to batter the two mercilessly. But at last a glimmer of hope at the end of the arduous tunnel. Orym and Embark had stumbled across the remaining tribes of the planet. That of the fiery recluses, the stalwart beasts, and the sacred lakeside trees. Although this encounter brought no clues as to Ningirsu's whereabouts, Orym and Embark were blessed with the legends and knowledge of the tribes. And by linking them together, Orym was able to unlock a great secret power of the world and witnessed the tremendous power that slumbered in its depths. It made him think of the world chalice powers that were bestowed to him. But this was greater, far greater, hiding unbeknownst to the dwellers of the planet. Was this what Lee had sought? Orym thought. What were the more secrets dwelled beneath the surface? One of them was the rebirth records, inscribed with the history of the planet chronicles from generations long forgotten. And the other, bygone memories of the planet's glorious age where humans ruled from the apex. Long, long ago, there was a god who ruled the skies. With dragonkind as its disciples, it perpetuated the cycles of destruction and rebirth to maintain the balance of the realms. However, the scale of the destruction grew bigger each time, and, one day, the balance of the two was thrown into great disarray. Once this delicate balance toppled, even the sacred skies could not hold back the destruction it wrought. The god decided that it could no longer oversee the skies by itself. With its powers of creation, it brought forth layers and layers of the toughest earth and sealed the powers of destruction within. With nowhere to go, the powers raged and raged until it boiled and scorched the very earth, morphing it. The torrent of power rushed through the land and merged with the powers of creation, leaking out onto the surface. It became a small manifestation of the cycle of death and rebirth, and gave life to the lands. With the last of its strength, the god then turned itself into a key, and entrusted it to the life blooming on the planet before vanishing. In the years following its disappearance, the powers of destruction re-emerged on the surface many times. However, every time it did, the life on the planet would use the key and, with the help of the dragonkind, push it back to whence it came. Over time, the key came to be known as his word, and the power of destruction as the Great Darkness. Thus, the great legend of the world hero was born.
Starlit hero, your sword swathed in light. May you triumph over the great darkness.
Decades, centuries, maybe millennia passed since the beginnings of the rebirth records. The land was now populated with life known as humanity. They were a civilization who had gained scientific knowledge and technological know-how, and were at the height of their prosperity. Their glory came at a cost, for it not only tore the planet's gifts away from it, but also the dragons who protected it. the god and the dragons that once were had faded into obscurity as mere tales. And it was during this time that the key was excavated and uncovered. The humans were exhilarated by such a legendary and mystical find. Although its authenticity became gradually acknowledged, some expressed worries and doubts at the discovery. What did it mean for the key to have resurfaced in this time? Was this an omen, warning them of an inevitable battle between the world hero and the great darkness, like the legend said? Now that they could see that the key existed in its sword form, did this not also mean that the powers of destruction were indeed sealed deep within the planet's crust? Humanity began to assemble their finest to analyze the key. Within the team that had formed, there was a scientist who has shown her talent in all fields of medicine, astronomy, and archaeology. Her name was Lee. Lee was known all over the world as the foremost authority on computer science. The analysis was able to proceed smoothly thanks to her involvement, and not long after, the team branded itself as an organization called Crusadia, under the jurisdiction of the Confederation of Nations. Once they had analyzed the key further, they began to draft a plan that would help fight the imminent threats to their planet. It would involve warriors of a mechanical nature, and they called it Project Mekk-Knight. Work was to proceed without a moment's delay. Meanwhile, Lee drew up a hypothesis and sought to validate it in secret. She wanted to get to the root of the appearance of the great darkness that world hero legend spoke of. Recorded in the legend were multiple tales of the key being used to drive back the great darkness by harnessing the powers of creation and destruction. It was a simple enough story. The great darkness would appear, and the world hero would fight it back with the key. However, could the reverse also not be true, that using the key was the very thing that drew the great darkness out? There were those who were entrusted with a divine mission, and the conspirators who sought to revive the powers of destruction. The world hero legend was ultimately a story of their power struggle over the key. Whoever has the key will control the fate of the world. Or so went Lee's hypothesis, anyway, and the more time she spent trying to validate it, the darker her ambitions grew.
The divine powers will be mine.
A few years have now passed since Project Mekk-Knight began. And finally, Mekk-Knight of the Morning Star was complete. It had been fitted with a core powered by the key and possessed enough power to fight the most deadly of wars. However, an incident occurred during its test run with none other than Lee as its test pilot. With the key, she had reversed all of the celestial powers coursing through its mechanical body and diverted them to the planet's core, faster than anyone could make a move. Lee had planned all this out before taking her place as test pilot. The power that had flowed into the planet's core split the lands, and once again, the destruction from within overflowed to the surface, scorching every bit of Earth that it touched. The entire world was beginning to split apart in this unprecedented disaster, and the revival of the great darkness drew ever nearer. However, its resurrection was not without its obstacles. The Crusadia had created, as assistive units, 7 Mekk-Knights in total. The remaining Mekk-Knights faced off against Mekk-Knight of the Morning Star and destroyed it, sealing away the great darkness back within the Earth once more. But the great darkness was, at the end of the day, a divine force, one that the mortals failed to seal away completely. Inspired by the key, the team decided to put their powers into physical vessels of their own, and left them on the surface as legacies. Now that the lands were ruined, it was getting harder and harder to live in such conditions. It seemed that life on this planet would be gradually snuffed out, including humanity.
The reason why the Master of the Key, the world hero, didn't appear in our time of need is because we humans drained the planet of its powers,
thought the Crusadia. They began to mobilize to put an end to humanity's so-called glory, as it was the largest obstacle to the revival of the barren lands and the planet's chances at surviving. They left the 7 Mekk-Knights they had built in their ruined world, after they were programmed with instructions to help rekindle the planet. The Mekk-Knights were also installed with data of the Crusadia members they had established a brain link with. If the lands could be healed once more and the planet could take back the power it once had, then perhaps they could avoid imminent disaster. The Crusadia left all their hopes to a faraway future they may not even reach. However, there was one thing they failed to realize. The mastermind behind this incident was Lee, and she had already been taken by the burning lands. When she was found, she was already dead. but only in flesh. Her soul had been released from its physical vessel and she had transferred into World Legacy, World Chalice, her will and knowledge.
The tremendous power that dwelled within the planet was the very thing that Lee was after?
Thought Orim. Suddenly, he was struck by a sense of terror. He could feel a great force of malice that threatened the planet, but from where, he could not tell. Perhaps someone, somewhere, was beckoning to the darkness, trying to bring it forth. He had to stop them before another terrible disaster happened. And in that moment, in Orim's mind, the figure of Ningirsu appeared. The figure of his childhood friend, tormented with sadness from the loss of IB, seeking darkness in his despair at the world. Although slight, he could feel Ningirsu's presence within the malice. It couldn't be. Orim reined his uneasy heart in. He would need help to stop this malice. He asked the elders of each tribe to lend him their strength, and they answered his pleas with a great number of warriors, and the tribes united in a formidable alliance. They named themselves after the warriors of old that their writings spoke of, and thus, the second coming of the Crusadia was born. The Crusadia were taken to a hidden spot by the tribe of the Sacred Trees and activated World Legacy, World Crown. Orim and his companions had now obtained power that could help them combat the malice that threatened their world. The Crusadia began their advance toward the giant tower at the center of all the malice. The orchestrated Babel, towering into the sky in its metallic magnificence. Surrounding it were the Orchest, mechanical weapons waiting on standby in silent formations. At the tower's base was Ningirsu, and activating World Legacy World Wand was the only thing on his mind. Now that Orim could see his childhood friend, the swordsman could only think about how much sadder he looked. Orim prayed that he was only overthinking the situation, but he knew that their reality was not a kind one. Ningirsu was here because he wanted the powers of darkness, and he was at the center of the malice Orim had felt. That was the truth that awaited him at the end of his long search. But no matter how much time had passed, no matter how things had changed, the one thing that remained the same was that Ningirsu was still his friend. Orim thought about what he could do now that he was here. He had to stop Ningirsu from starting a disaster that could mean the end of their world.
The only one who can stop this villainy is me,
Orim thought, gathering all his courage. He signaled for his companions to mobilize. And now, a new battle was about to begin. The Crusadia headed toward where Ningirsu was. However, before they could reach him, they had to get past the countless Orchest weaponry. The Orchest were merciless as they were numerous, and the Crusadia suffered greatly as they tried to fight their way through. In the heat of the battle, Orim began to feel that within orchestrated Babel, there dwelled a power similar to that of his key. The mechanical vessels used whatever little of the key's powers they had inherited and activated orchestrated Babel. From the depths of the tower, a great light was released and the tower itself seemed to almost fall away with it as the beam stretched into the sky above.
No! The activation must be stopped!
Orim thought as he dashed toward the machinery. However, before he could move any further, Ningirsu appeared before him. It was the first time they had seen each other since that tragedy long ago. Their eyes met within the chaos of the battle. Ningirsu's sorrow. When Ningirsu saw what had happened, a bolt of guilt pierced through his grief. Even in his desperation, he never imagined this would happen. His eyes could hardly believe what they were seeing. How did all this happen so fast? He prayed that he was dreaming, and that he was going to wake soon. All he wanted was to see his dear sister again. As the scene of another nightmare unfurled around him, he became embroiled in a storm of emotions.
I need to save IB.
Even as his mind was numbed with stupor, Ningirsu's body began to move without command. In what looked like an impulsive choice, he struck his childhood friend unconscious, taking both the other man's sword and IB. What good was this world if IB were not in it? He would do anything, be it good or evil, if it meant that he could see her smile again. That single thought of getting his sister back was all Ningirsu needed to force his weary limbs forward. He had the Mekk-Knight cores from when the 6 nightmares were defeated. And now, he also had the sword he took from Orim. Using the facilities that were still present in the Mekk-Knight headquarters, he analyzed the artifacts with feverish desperation. This world possessed a mystical power similar to that of the world legacies, and if anything had a clue regarding its specifics, it would be the Mekk-Knights. They might even have a way to bring IB back. Although he was unable to glean a way to resurrect IB, he learned a great deal about a number of facilities from the ancient civilization. Ningirsu left the Mekk-Knight headquarters and set off to each one of them with the lifeless body of his sister in tow. Many of the facilities he visited had already ceased to work, and the ones that barely did provided little to no useful information. However, Ningirsu never gave up. There must be a way he could save IB somehow. With that unwavering belief in his heart, he resumed his grueling journey. And finally, at long last, he discovered an ancient facility that was still in working condition. After countless weary roads walked, Ningirsu had gone through more information than any average man would in his life. He had thoroughly inspected the Mekk-Knight cores and several ancient facilities. With what he had gathered, including files on the key and technologies thought to be long lost, he had finally unlocked the secrets hidden within the planet. In the truths of the world that had been shrouded in mystery, Ningirsu trembled with joy. He could revive his sister now. With his newfound certainty, Ningirsu set about creating a vessel that could house IB's soul using the ancient technologies. However, this task was to be the most difficult yet. Trial after trial resulted in countless failures and their byproducts. And as the days ticked by, he had amassed enough vessels to create his own army. But at last, his efforts paid off. He had finally created a mechanical doll that would work. By synchronizing the doll with the body of his dead sister, he also succeeded in reinitializing the functions of one of the twin swords vital to his plan. So much time had been poured into this endeavor, but at least there was something to show for it. A strange sense of elation began to bubble within Ningirsu. His sister had given her life for this world. Now it was time for him to create a new world for her. Now that Ningirsu had the mechanical doll's powers, the second step of the plan to build orchestrated Babel could finally begin. Orim opened his mouth to speak.
Why?
He asked.
Would you want anything to do with the Great Darkness? Why put our planet under threat like this? Why did you create this spiraling tower and this army of mechanical weapons?
Ningirsu had only one simple answer for him.
For IB.
It was the only reason he needed. For his sister, he was willing to activate Babel to strike the world legacy world wand down from the skies and break the Earth's surface. so he could awaken the slumbering World Legacy World Arc and use its influence over life and death to revive IB's soul. Then, after the Great Darkness had been freed from within the earth, he was going to use its powers to resurrect IB as a celestial being. Now that he had heard the truth from Ningirsu, Orym readied his sword and knew that he had to stop this at all cost. Ningirsu didn't budge, and instead swung his lance in return. No one was going to stand in his way, not even Orym. The swordsman knew that Ningirsu loved IB more than anyone in the world. But that did not make it right for him to put their entire planet in danger like this. Orym knew that IB would not want this even if it meant that she could live once more. However, for Ningirsu, there was nothing he wanted more than to see his sister open her eyes again. And if it meant that he had to turn against the entire world, then so be it. Both men had already made their minds up on what they wanted to achieve. Neither wanted to budge, and so they clashed, but neither could gain a decisive advantage. The orchestrated babble activated. And at last, the World One had been toppled. When it fell to the earth, it gored the land below, and the resulting shockwave reverberated across the entire planet. Where the World Legacy leads. With Babble's activation, World Legacy - World 1 tore through the sky and fell on Earth. Its tremendous mass pierced the Earth below. Just as its devastating aftershock was about to strike the warriors of the Crusadia, a blinding light fell upon Orym's eyes. A light even brighter than from the battle with Abli. Embark had used the power of the gods to call forth a gigantic barrier. As the gust of destruction blew past them, the barrier dissipated. Embark had sacrificed his life to shield the Crusadia. With his life force depleted, Embark falls to the ground. Orym is left speechless as he touches Embark's fallen body. The body of his invaluable ally. A wave of guilt rushes into his mind, as it did once before. But there was no time for sorrow for either Orym or the Crusadia. The fall of the World Wand exposed the World Legacy World Arc and activated it. The fallen Embark was then consumed by the World Arc. The power the World Arc has over life and death was infused with the godly power of Embark. And this combination took the form of a two-headed dragon. Gardragon Anrake, which then descended toward Orym. The Gardragons had awakened. The shattering power rippled through the planet and reshaped each World Legacy into a draconic form. Even as the World Legacies took the forms of dragons, Ningirsu was not fazed by their threat. IB's revival. That was the sole thing that pushed him forward. Carrying the body of LB in his arms, he approaches the mechanical doll. Using the key embedded in it, he should be able to control even the draconic World Legacies. Ningirsu attempts to revive IB's soul, using the key to control the World Arc and its power over life and death. And finally, at long last, a brother's wish for his sister was to be fulfilled. The doll slowly absorbs IB's remains. Smile for me again, like you used to before. Ningirsu calls upon IB. IB and the doll become one. The soul's revival is complete. However, the soul now bound within the machine body was not that of whom he sought for. The smile on her face was not the compassionate smile of IB. but a wicked grin frozen in place. A smile belonging to Lee, who had merged with IB's soul. The resurrected Lee took control of the puppet and using the power of the key, she decimated what remained of IB's soul. She then called upon the now draconic world legacies and consumed them, growing to enormous size. By consuming IB's remains and the 5 dragons, Lee turned into a monster Noah's nightmare incarnation at Lee. Lee then used the power of the key and the world legacy to create a crawler as large as a mountain, named Deus Ex Crawler. Orem and his allies noticed that the spinal protrusion stretching from the dais was connected to the sealed Great Darkness. As they approach to stop it, a dreadful black dragon blocks their way. It had been consumed by a deathly force and become Lee's vanguard. It used to be Embark. Now he had become World Legacy Guard Dragon Mardark. After the battle with the Orchest and being engulfed in the shattering world, the Crusadia was left barely standing. And now World Legacy Guard Dragon Mardark stands in their way. Was it inevitable that the Great Darkness would fall into Lee's hands? Just as Orem was about to give in, a flying dragon lands before Lee. It was Guard Dragon Justicia, from the Forest of the Stars. The shimmering blue dragon used its power to rip out IB's body that was bound to Lee. In that moment, it began to shine brighter, enveloping the area with a flash. Then, the light gathers. As Orem opens his eyes, he sees the figure of a young girl. The kind eyes of the girl he knew so well. Ningirsu's sister, his childhood friend. Their time in the village. Their quest for the world legacy. He had shared his hardships and joys with her. It was none other than IB. She had supposedly been destroyed by Lee, yet she stood before his eyes. Orem and IB were reunited once again. Yet there was no time to rejoice, as another calamity soon occurred. Lee's body, now separated from the key and its inheritor IB, could no longer control the world legacy, and went into overdrive. Lee howls as Orem and IB turn to Mardark, who has suffered a similar fate. To save their friend Embark from the deathly force possessing him, they attempt to call upon his soul. Their call drives it from his body, and awakens his soul within. The awakened Embark amplifies his life force and is reborn as the divine dragon World Chalice Guard Dragon Almarduk. Even during this transformation, Lee's rampage continued. And at last, the monstrosity dug up by Deus Ex Crawler reared its head. Upon seeing the abomination, IB explains. This is the true form of the Great Darkness. It is the embodiment of the divine power, world gears of theological demiurgy. Ningirsu originally attempted to use the key in the machine body to control the draconic world legacies, and thus try to revive IB's soul. However, this procedure failed. It instead awakened Lee, who took control of her body and spirit. As Ningirsu falls into despair, a miracle happens before his eyes. A shining blue dragon appears, and fuses with IB's remains. As a result, his sister, the person he cherished more than anyone else, has returned. Was he dreaming? Is this real? What has happened? As Ningirsu considers this, he feels something reach out to his soul. It was what remains of a fading mind, belonging to the vessel made to house IB's soul. It was the echo of the doll's final thoughts. It was nothing more than an artificial body. But perhaps through the power of its host, or because of the power of the key. the empty vessel grew a consciousness that was neither IB or Lee. Who the conscience belonged to or if it was similar to humans the doll did not know. However, it still had a heart to care for its master. When a newly revived Lee attempted to erase the soul of IB, the doll transferred IB's soul to World Legacy-World Chalice in the Forest of the Stars and sacrificed itself to save her. Ironically, this was the same method Lee used to deceive humankind. But Lee failed to notice, as the purity of the doll's heart was indistinguishable from IB's. Having heard this final echo, Ningirsu clutched the sash that had belonged to IB, the doll, and Galatea, and stood with renewed determination. At last, the Great Darkness, the avatar of divine power, had arrived. World Gears of Theological Demiurgy. Facing such an overwhelming foe, Orym remembered a passage from The Legend of the Star Heroes. To fend off the Great Darkness, Orym informs IB and his Crusadia allies of his plan of action. His plan was to inherit the key, which Mekk-Knight Blue Sky had once attempted and failed. He aims to use that power to combine the gathered world legacies into a single entity. Assisted by IB and his allies, he begins the unification. Upon realizing Orym's plan, the desperate nightmare incarnation Lee attempts to stop him. Imbark and the Crusadia gave their all to defend Orym and IB. However, Lee's attack was tremendous. Just then, a man with a sash clenched in his fist came forth to face the challenge. It was Ningirsu. He gathered all the remaining parts from Babel and the Orchest and forged a colossal spear. With it, he strikes at Lee with a ferocious blow. Gathering up all his might, Ningirsu then forges his final and ultimate creation. A creation intended to protect the divine reincarnation of IB. It was a colossus combining every Orchest, and even the creator himself. Ningirsu, the Orchest of the Evening Star, had been born. Lee continued her rampage, still desperate for the divine powers. Ningirsu, now with the power of a machine god, did not hesitate while striking with his spear. Subjected to this fierce assault, Lee's body begins to fall apart. And even yet, Lee's tainted spirit was obsessed with attaining godhood. With her sanity long lost, Lee used Deus Ex Crawler to forcefully bind her soul to the world legacy. In response to her tainted mind, Demiurgy loses all control. The overflowing power of the gods was enough to accelerate the destruction of the planet. Orym and IB continue the key's accession, and their allies stand to defend the two. The planet's destruction looked inevitable, but not a single soul was about to give up. Each and every one stood firm to fight against the divine power. And at last, the accession was complete. With Orym having inherited the key, he wielded the power of every world legacy as the legendary world hero. Mekk-Knight Crusadia Avramax.
Starlit hero, your sword swathed in light. May you triumph over the great darkness.
Orym wields his powers to evade, block, and neutralize the thrashing waves of destruction. And he gradually closes in on the rampaging world gears of theological demiurgy. Making his way inside it, it was as if he was being guided toward its innermost sanctum. In the sanctum awaited Lee, but not in her fairy form. Instead, she had the form of a human. It was the faint remainder of her consciousness. Faced with the woman who had so stubbornly strived to obtain the god's power, Orym asks,
Why did you go down this path?
Lee, standing in front of him, did not open her mouth. Instead, her obsessive thoughts and memories that pervaded the surrounding area rushed into Orym through the key he held.
Thirst for knowledge as a woman of science and the pursuit of truth.
If it was only so simple, the world may not have ended up this way. But Lee's ambitions were that out of the ordinary. She wanted to discover the truth behind the legends, and she did not hesitate to seek the divine power for herself. Was this merely a coincidence, or an inevitable fate? The calamity came about because Lee lived in an era in which the key existed and society was highly developed. More thoughts and memories rush into Orym. This time, it was Lee's nightmarish plan.
The divine powers will be mine.
To obtain them requires complete dominance over the power of the key. However, the overdeveloped civilization of machines had sapped the power from the Earth. As such, the humans of that era could not commune with the planet and thus could not become the successor of the key. If civilization must fall, so be it. Lee used Project Mekk-Knight and even her own death as a means to bring destruction to the world. After an eternity, she waited for the Earth and its inhabitants to heal and to find the true heir of the key. And now, that time has come. As Lee's glee in meeting IB, and her excitement in gaining control of her rushed into him, Orym clutched the key with anger and sorrow. Lee was driven by nothing more than obsessive curiosity. There was no sacrifice too great for her goal. She had destroyed a civilization and toyed with the lives of many. Though her actions did not bear malice, they were nothing short of evil. The Crusadia, World Legacy, and IB. Countless times, she hid her true intentions, and ultimately, she attained divine power. World gears of theological demiurgy, the primordial form of all gods. A vessel allowing divine deeds, in accordance with the will of its controller, the program of transformation. Those who had become gods before eventually lost control of the power of destruction and were decimated, leaving only the key. To avoid that fate herself, Lee laid out her plans carefully. She integrated the crawler in its hive mind to achieve complete control over the divine powers. Or so it was intended. In the face of IB and Imducks will to sacrifice their own lives. The miracle achieved by the machine doll. And Ningirsu's determination. Orym became the successor, overcoming sorrow, and uniting people along his journey. Lee still could not comprehend how her plan had been foiled by the combination of their willpower. As the remnants of Lee's mind vanish, a source of enormous power remained unclaimed. Orym, as the successor, needed to make a choice. The demiurgy, corrupted by Lee's evil, has already rampaged across the planet and reduced it to rubble. The power of destruction once sealed by the gods grows yet stronger. The power of creation that served as the planet's core was mostly extinguished. Memories of his journey come back to him, the memories of his loyal friends and allies. What is it he must do as the successor of the key? After a moment that seemed like an eternity, Orym makes his decision. As if in response to his will, the power of the key was released. Aurum and Demiurge turned into a ray of light and merged into a single entity. Amidst the dying world, a new god was born. Here was Avita, rebuilder of worlds. Aurum, now wielding unprecedented power equal to the gods, slowly raised his key and gave a command. The decision he made was,
Bring back all those lives lost amidst this war over the word legacy. And by raising me to godhood, allow me to end the reign of the gods, and prevent conflict over divine power from happening ever again.
These seemingly conflicting commands were the result of his wishes. Perhaps this was blasphemy, a choice no human had a right to make. But this was what Aurum chose, and so Avita, rebuilder of worlds, started the program. The crumbling earth turned into particles of light and gathered before Avita, rebuilder of worlds. All was engulfed in blinding light. Countless time has passed since that battle. The war over the world legacy. At its climax, Aurum wished for the revival of the planet and the lives lost. He then disappeared without a trace. The planet was once destined to be destroyed by the destructive divine power. However, the battle scars of the war had vanished like an illusion. Lush green nature fills the land, and life blossomed as it always used to. In a world without Aurum, one final gift was left for IB. The key that controls the fate of the planet, the sword with the power of the world legacy. The world legacy world key. IB, with the sword from Aurum in hand, set out on a journey to remember the planet that her beloved brother protected. Embark accompanies IB, and Ningirsu watches over them from afar. Born anew as the protector of IB and the planet, he is tasked with ensuring Aurum's wish is realized. Accompanying him as he supports IB from the shadows in the now peaceful world is the fairy Galatea. Under the glistening starlight, IB takes the sword in her hand, and it shines faintly. She and Embark follow the ray of light toward the sky. Where does the world go from here? Hope is abundant once more. IB carries on forth, guided by the world legacy to what lies beyond.